All right, hi everybody. Welcome back. Professor Jeff here with another video from Language Power by Professor Dana Ferris. Today we're going to talk about tutorial 19. We're going to talk about verb tense shifts and contrasts. Just like usual, I'm going to read through this chapter with you, explain some ideas that might sound confusing or complex. But again, like always, I want you to write down any questions that you have, pause this video, ask yourself if you understand, be prepared to bring questions or ideas to our Zoom meetings, or send me an email, send me a text, whatever you need to do to make sure that these ideas are clear. Before we begin, I just want to say that this is not a usual ESL chapter about verb tenses, right? In many other books, you might see a chapter all about the past perfect verb tense, how to use it, practice, practice, practice. And again, we'll get some opportunities to do that, and especially when we're doing writing, you'll get to practice making the verb tenses. But I think one big challenge for students is not just how to make the verb tense, right? So for example, I said the past perfect, so to say had gone, or had seen, or had walked, whatever. I think it's knowing when to use which verb tense, which is really what this chapter is all about. So it's a really important chapter. So again, go slow, pause, rewind this video as much as you need to make sure the ideas are clear, and be ready to bring questions with you that we can practice when we're together. So we are here on page 297 in Language Power. Again, that is Language Power Tutorial 19, Verb Tense Shifts and Contrasts. Let's go. Now, because verbs appear in every sentence and using them correctly can sometimes be challenging, several other tutorials address different aspects of verb usage, including tutorials 1, 2, 3, 4, 11, and 14. In this tutorial, we focus on errors made in using verb tense, that's the time frame, in writing. We look at two separate but related, connected problems. One, shifting between verb tenses incorrectly. Shifting is just another way to say changing, right? And using the wrong verb tense, very common errors. So while the first problem is common among all writers of English, the second is more typical of learners of English as a second or additional language. So before we get started, things to ask yourself. 1. What do I already know about shifting verb tenses within a narrative or a paragraph? 2. How can I select and form the correct verb tenses for a text I'm writing? And 3, how can I edit my own writing to find and correct errors in verb tense usage? I think for everybody, any level, especially for English language learners, this is the magic key, right? How do I edit my own work? How do I find my own errors? How do I prevent myself from making errors in the first place? So let's continue on page 298. As usual, the tutorial begins with a discover activity. Here are the instructions. And as usual, I'll encourage you, pause the video here, look at this activity, try to do it on your own, bring questions, and be prepared to talk about it. So here are the instructions. Let's see what you already know about identifying verb tenses. The following text excerpt is from a student essay published in a newspaper in 1991. It includes verbs in the simple present tense, the simple past tense, and the present perfect tense. Assess your own knowledge of these tenses by 1, underlining all verbs or verb phrases that include one of these tenses, and 2, labeling each one as present, simple past, or present perfect. You can use the chart that follows the excerpt to record your findings. The first is done for you as an example. When you've completed the chart, write a brief paragraph in response to the prompt that follows. So again, here's the first sentence, and we'll look at the chart over here. So I once heard my aunt, herself a teacher, speculate on why educators refuse to use computers to their full capacity. Here, Professor Ferris has underlined heard, and she identifies it here in the chart, heard, and tells us that it's the simple past. So again, I'll just do this next one for us. So herself as a teacher speculate on why. Now again, we could analyze this sentence in a lot of ways, but we're only doing the verbs. So here's educators, educators, educators. That's going to be a subject in our clause here. And refuse is our verb. Refuse is our verb. So I'm going to go ahead and type this one in for us if I can figure out how to do that. Actually, you know what? Just for time for this video, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is, in this box right here, where my green hourglass is, you'd write refuse. And here we have educators refuse, and that's in the simple present tense. And again, remember, this activity is asking you to focus on how different verb tenses change, even in the same sentence, right? We have a sentence with the simple past at the beginning, and then we have an example of a clause that has a new subject and a new verb tense, refuse. So here you'd put refuse, and here you'd put simple present. So again, pause the video. Thanks for your patience while I was fighting the computer. Pause the video here. Try to go through this whole excerpt, this whole reading, and see if you can identify the verbs and the verb tenses. Great. Moving on to page 300. So, considering verb tense shifts. Writers often will change back and forth between past and present tense, especially in writing that includes narrative. That's a story from personal experience, a retelling of a plot in a literary analysis paper, a description of a historical event, or even a report on a science experiment or statistical procedures. As we saw in the text in the discovery activity, such shifts can be perfectly appropriate and correct and normal, like I said. So this idea interested me, simple past tense. So over the years, I have watched teachers to decide whether or not they could be replaced by robots. My conclusion is that the best teachers could never possibly be replaced by machines. The writer moves from describing an experience in the past to a statement of opinion that he holds in the present. In other words, the shift from past tense to present tense, even from one sentence to the next in the middle of the same paragraph, can be natural and accurate. Thus, so, therefore. Consistent verb tense, keeping all verbs in the same tense, is not necessarily the goal. Appropriate verb tense depends on the context and meaning. And again, as you know from this class, context is everything. The key is being aware of what tense you're using, when you're shifting tenses, and what tense is appropriate for your writing situation. Writers sometimes make errors by incorrectly shifting their tenses in the middle of a narrative. Consider this example. A couple of years ago, my mom took my friend Sydney and me to Southern California on vacation. As we drove down the Pacific Coast Highway on our way to our hotel, our friend Heidi texts us, saying that she and her boyfriend Zach broke up again. Sydney calls her right away to see if Heidi is doing okay, but really it was because Sydney used to date Zach and wants him back herself. In this personal narrative, the past tense verbs are highlighted, and the present tense verbs are underlined. The entire story happened in the past, and the time frame should have stayed in the past tense throughout the whole paragraph. However, the writer shifted to the present tense in the middle of the second sentence, starting with the verb texts, and then shifted back and forth between present and past for the rest of the story. The only way to shift to the present tense might be correct in such a narrative is if the writer adds a summary statement about the story, such as the following. Looking back on this now, I realize that Sydney never was a trustworthy friend, and I am glad we drifted apart after that trip. And I'm just going to highlight this, looking back on this now, as you'll see her talk about. While these types of verb tense shifts seem easy enough to notice in someone else's text, they're surprisingly common in high school or college student writing. Why? Perhaps writers simply forget which tense they started in. More likely, it's because they often recount past events in the present tense in casual conversation. So again, when speaking. So this morning, I'm in the grocery store, and this idiot cuts in front of me in the express line, and he has at least 20 items in his cart. It's sort of more normal conversational speaking, and definitely if you go out and walk around the street, you could definitely hear someone speaking like this. Pretty normal, at least in the United States. Another possible point of confusion stems from what's called the literary present. You've probably seen this usage in your assigned readings, definitely for college readings. So writers use the literary present to describe various aspects of works of literature, books and poetry and film even sometimes. So consider this example about Romeo and Juliet, in which the writer's present tense verb is highlighted. As Shakespeare writes in Romeo and Juliet, parting is such sweet sorrow. This also applies to any retelling of the action. Romeo kills himself when he thinks that Juliet is dead. Students may have been exposed to the literary present rule without realizing that it doesn't usually apply to other types of narrative in writing, such as one's own personal experience or retelling a historical event. And really, this literary present you don't need to worry about too much for our class, but if you go to an English class, if you take a literature class, even some social sciences classes in the humanities, you may see people use the present tense even though they're talking about events that happened in a story or a book in the past, right? This is an example from Shakespeare, over 400 years old, Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet 400 years ago, but in this example, right, as Shakespeare writes. So this isn't about is the literary present good, bad, right, wrong, doesn't matter. Professor Ferris is just trying to show us how verb tense changes depending on context, right, which is the whole idea of the book. So we're on page 302 for the first practice 1 of this tutorial. Practice 1. The instructions say, the following text excerpt is from a literary analysis paper written for a high school English class that discusses several short stories. Underline any inappropriate verb tense shifts in the paragraph and suggest ways to correct them in the context of the passage. Then write a brief paragraph that describes the errors you found, provides specific examples, discusses what the correct forms might be, and explains why you think the writer might have made the errors. So again, pause the video here, look at page 302, try and do this activity on your own, and be prepared to bring questions to class. All right, moving on to 303, understanding different verb tenses. Verb tenses in English can be challenging, especially for learners of English. We all know this. One reason they're challenging is that there are a lot of them. Tense and aspect can form 12 different combinations. Aspect refers to the state of completion. Completion means, is it finished or not finished? Is it ongoing or done of the action of the verb? There are 3 basic aspects. The simple, the statement is generally true. Dogs have bad breath. Generally true all the time. Progressive. The statement describes an action in progress. My dog is wagging her tail. It's happening right now. And the perfect aspect. The statement describes a completed action. The dog has finished her dinner. She was eating, but now that eating is done, she has finished. The perfect and progressive aspects may also be combined to describe an action that was in progress and then completed. That's everyone's favorite past perfect progressive. We'll get there. The following chart, continued on page 304, shows the 12 verb tense aspect combinations. The key verb phrases are highlighted. So I will read these out loud. We'll go slow. This is not the most exciting thing, and it's challenging because there's lots of details. But again, the more you see it, the more you hear it, the sooner it will become natural, feel natural. So, the present tense with a simple aspect, cats are nocturnal animals. The past tense with a simple aspect, my cat liked to hunt outside at night. Future tense with a simple aspect, we will get another cat after we retire. Now, tense, the present tense, but in the progressive aspect is the cat is stalking the bird. Past tense with the progressive aspect is the cat was stalking the bird until it flew away. And future tense with the progressive aspect, the cat will be stalking birds until she's too old and feeble to go outside anymore. Then we have the present tense with the perfect aspect. My cat has presented me with several live mice as gifts. The past tense with the perfect aspect, our cat had brought us many mice before she got too old to hunt. The future tense with the perfect aspect, on March 26th, our cat will have lived with us for 16 years. The present tense with the perfect progressive aspect, the cat has been stalking birds since she was a tiny kitten. The past tense with the perfect progressive aspect, our cat had been sleeping for hours, but she woke up when it was time for dinner. And number 12, the last one, the future tense with the perfect progressive aspect, in July, we will have been living in our house for 14 years. Another reason English verb tenses are challenging is that a couple of the tenses have similar purposes. We use them in similar ways or situations, so it can be difficult to decide which tense is most appropriate for a specific sentence. For example, the differences between the perfect and the progressive... let me back up here. For example, the differences between the perfect and the perfect progressive forms are subtle. And in many cases, the combined tense and aspects forms could be used interchangeably without causing any confusion. Means you could use them the same way. So for example, the present perfect, my cat has stalked birds since she was a tiny kitten. Present perfect progressive, continuous, my cat has been stalking birds since she was a tiny kitten. Professor Ferris asks, what's the difference between the two? Well, the first sentence implies that the cat is finished with stalking birds, while the second suggests that she will continue to do so. But because present perfect is often used to express actions that began in the past but continue in the present, the differences between the two sentences can seem slight to most proficient speakers of English. I'll even just add native speakers of English. So for instance, the statement, we have lived in our house for almost 14 years, might mean that the family is about to load up the moving vans and go somewhere else. However, someone might say that sentence or something similar even without any intention of moving. Another challenging characteristic of English aspect and tense combinations is how their use may require multiple verb tenses in the same sentence. Now, in the chart on pages 303 and 304, you can see this in the past perfect and past perfect progressive examples. Past perfect is used to describe a past action that took place before another past action. Consider this sentence. Our cat had brought us many mice before she got too old to hunt. There are two different past tense verbs in this sentence, brought and got. If the past tense means before now, past perfect means before a later past action. Now in this sentence, the cat first brought us many mice and later got too old to hunt, but both events are in the before now past. So, because of the specific purpose of the past perfect, it will almost always be combined in a sentence with another simple past tense verb. And we'll get to practice this more, but this rule is really important. So pause this, read that sentence over and over and over again, but this is really important to understand, right? So the past perfect, we use it in conjunction with, together with the simple past to talk about two events, both of them that happened in the past. Now, similarly, in the chart on pages 303 and 304, both the simple future and future progressive sentences are combined in sentences with simple present verbs. So we will get another cat after we retire. Retire, will get. The cat will be stalking birds until she is too old and feeble to go outside anymore. As with the past perfect, these constructions describe two actions that will happen in the future after now, but one will happen before the other. So in the sentence, we will get another cat after we retire. First we will retire, then we will get another cat, but both actions are in the future. In short, to combine verb tense and aspect correctly in a sentence, a writer must, and here's her summary of this introduction part. First, understand the different verb tenses and aspects, how to form them, what their functions are. 2, select the appropriate combination of verb tense and aspect to reflect the intended meaning. And finally, number 3, in more complex verb tenses within the same sentence, make sure that the verb tenses appropriately match each other. So, simple past with past perfect, simple present with future, and so on. Again, I know that's a lot of information in only a few pages, so pause, rewind, back it up, write down those questions, email, text, come to Zoom, right? We'll talk about it. So next, moving on, forming verb tenses and aspect combinations. Now, this next section explains the process of forming the different verb tense and aspect combinations that are possible in English. Here we go. So, to form the simple tenses with the base form of the verb. So, to form the simple present, you use the base form of the verb. If the verb is in the third person singular form, you add an S or an ES. I go, you go, she goes. The verbs be and have are exceptional forms of the simple present. The exceptional means they're irregular. So for the first person simple present tense form of the verbs be and have, first I am, and we are, I have, we have, you are, you have, and third, he, she, it, they, is, or they are. Let me be clear here. He, she, it is, right? They are. He, she, it has, they have. So the simple past has a regular form, a base verb plus ed. So for example, hunt becomes hunted. There are also many irregular past tense verb forms. The following chart shows several examples, but there are many, many more, and I know you already know that there are a lot of irregular simple past tense verbs in English. So the verb be becomes was or were, have becomes had, take, took, eat, ate, put. As you can see in this chart, irregular past tense verb forms can vary widely. They can experience a complete change in form, as in the case of be, swap out final consonants like have becomes had, change an internal vowel sound, take becomes took, eat becomes ate, or have no change at all, put and put. Now the simple future is a bit easier to manage. Students like the simple future. It consists of the modal auxiliary will plus the base form of the verb. There's also an alternate form of simple future that consists of a form of the verb be plus going to plus the base form of the verb. So we are going to visit New Orleans next month. This alternate form is used slightly differently than the will form. It often is used to express something that will happen in the almost immediate future. I'm going to stop by the post office this afternoon. And we'll spend some more time looking at each individual verb tense and aspect combination here. Like Professor Ferris says, there are 12 of them. But I think this is a great tutorial, a great chapter to get a sort of big picture overview of all the 12 tenses, right? So now, form progressive tenses by adding ing to the base form of the verb. So the progressive forms are easier than the simple forms. To create them, you add an ing to the base form of the verb and then the appropriate form of the verb be. Consider again these examples from the chart on page 303. So present progressive, the cats are stalking the birds. Past progressive, the cat was stalking the birds when the dog chased her away. And future progressive, the cat will be stalking the birds until she's too old and feeble to do so anymore. Note also that for future progressive, you add will before the base form of be and then the verb plus ing. So, will be stalking. Will be stalking. Now, to form the perfect tenses by adding the auxiliary have to the past participle. That's the basic rule for making the perfect aspect. Excuse me. Like the progressive tenses, you create perfect forms by adding an auxiliary, a form of the verb have, to the past participle form of the main verb. The past participle is the third form of a verb, such as eaten. See tutorial 24 if you need more information. Now, the present perfect, I have eaten lunch already. Past perfect, I had eaten lunch already, so I didn't go out with my colleagues. And future perfect, I will have eaten lunch already, so don't worry about making anything for me. As with the progressive form, the future perfect starts with the auxiliary will, followed by the base form of the verb have, followed by the past participle form of the verb main verb, in this case eaten, right? And this is why this tense is so difficult, right? These future perfect and future perfect progressive forms, and the more auxiliaries, the more base forms, the more endings you have to add to the main verb, of course, it's more likely that, especially for language learners, we're going to make mistakes because there's all these different parts just to make this one form of the verb. That's why it's really challenging, right? And just takes practice. Now, you need to complete 3 steps to form the perfect progressive tenses. Now, the perfect progressive tenses are used relatively rarely. That's the good news. I want you to be able to read them and recognize them when you see them, but you're probably not going to use them very often, even in academic writing. They are relatively rare, just like Professor Ferris says. They are complicated, yet also fairly easy to understand. Creating them always involves 3 simple steps. So 1, add the appropriate form of have. So have, had, will have. Present, past, future. Add the past participle form of be, been, and use the present participle form of the main verb. That's verb plus ing. So for example, with the verb swim, you would end up with the following sentences. Present perfect progressive. I have been swimming at the pool for 5 years. Past perfect progressive. I had been swimming there for 5 years before the pool closed. Future perfect progressive. On October 5th, I will have been swimming there for 5 years. And again, notice have, present, had, past, will have, future. So again, I think you start to see how these different pieces come together and how when you put them together like puzzle pieces, that's how you make up these different tenses, right? So again, this is a lot of information. Pause, stop, rewind. That's one great thing about watching this in the video. Make sure you understand these ideas and bring your questions. We'll get to practice them this semester. So again, like usual, skip the sidebar if you want. If you want to, go deep, keep reading. I'm going to keep going here on 309, avoiding verb tense problems. Now, as you might imagine, with so many choices about verb tenses in a text, it can be easy to make the wrong decision. In reality, however, writers tend to confuse only a few verb tenses. This section highlights several of the most common errors in verb tense use and offers strategies for monitoring problem tenses in your own writing. So first, you need to understand when to use the simple past or the simple present tense. As we discussed in the first part of this tutorial, student writers sometimes incorrectly shift between present and past tense while writing narratives. A different type of past versus present tense error occurs when writers simply use past tense when they mean present tense or vice versa. And again, you can see tutorial 24 for verb form errors. Here are two common examples. I traveled to Europe many times with my family during my childhood. Use the present tense. When we're talking about the childhood, we should have used simple past. I didn't wanted to go home yet. Errors that language learners make a lot. You used the simple past form of the verb. We don't need ed because we mark tense here with did when we have this auxiliary. Now, there are two different sources of confusion here. In many other languages, verb tense is marked by the context rather than an actual change to the verb. Thus, in the first example, the writer may believe that the sentence already clearly communicates that the time frame is the past because of other markers such as many times and during my childhood, so it's unnecessary to mark the verb travel with the past tense suffix ed. In the second example, the writer wants to convey the past tense, but has already done so by using the past tense auxiliary did in the verb tense. When auxiliaries are already marked for tense like this, the base form of the verb, want, is used instead of the simple past form. English doesn't need or allow a verb phrase to have the verb tense marked twice, but tense must be marked at least once in the verb phrase. So again, let's pause, look at practice 2. Now, the following sentences contain errors in use of past or present tense. Find the errors, suggest a revision, and explain how you know which tense form to use. Again, like usual, I'll do one example together. So, when I was in high school, I enjoy sports. So here we have a dependent clause at the beginning. When, was, the simple past tense is used here. It's pretty clear that this person is no longer in high school. The context is telling me that they're talking about the past. But in the second clause, in the independent clause, they have I enjoy, and they've used the simple present tense here. So they should have used simple past because they already marked and indicated that this was talking about the past tense. But in English, even if we have a new clause, we still have to mark this and keep the same tense in this example sentence. So enjoy should be enjoyed. If that didn't make sense, pause and rewatch. Moving on. 311. Now, know when to use the simple present versus the present progressive tense. So it's fairly easy to describe the difference between these two tenses. Simple present is used to express an action or a state of being that's generally or always true, while present progressive describes an action that is ongoing now, happening, occurring, ongoing now. So simple present, my dog eats dinner every day at 4 p.m. Simple present, she is very unhappy if I get home late. Present progressive, she is jumping excitedly because she knows it's time to eat. However, sometimes in everyday conversation we use these tenses interchangeably. As I walk in the door, my dog starts jumping because she knows it's dinner time. As I'm walking in the door, my dog starts jumping because she knows it's dinner time. Most readers will not be overly distracted by uses of the simple present or progressive tense. However, you can be more precise, clear, specific if you're clear on the different purposes of the two forms. So again, more examples here on page 312. I used to tell my best friend everything, but now I think I should be more careful about what I say to her. I used to tell my best friend everything, but now I'm thinking I should be more careful about what I say to her. Which verb tense is better for this sentence? They're both grammatically correct, but they communicate slightly different things. I think means that you've come to a general understanding about the situation. You've kind of made a decision. In I am thinking suggests that you're considering, you're still thinking, you're not sure about this question right now, and perhaps that the thinking process is still underway. Also, know when to use the simple past or present perfect tenses. So, simple past tense describes an action completed in the past time. The present perfect describes an action that began in the past but is still true in the present. So, simple past, I traveled to Italy. Present perfect, I have traveled in Italy, France, and England. Completed in the past. Completed in the past, still true in the present. The differences are subtle, as Professor Ferris says. The first sentence clearly conveys a description of a past trip that is over. The second also describes completed travels, but the use of present perfect implies that there may be more trips to come in the future, as in this longer example. I've traveled in Italy, France, and England, so the next time I go to Europe, I would like to visit Spain. One more note about the use of the present perfect here. While the present time communicates that the statement is still relevant at the moment of writing, the perfect aspect also conveys the past action has been completed. Contrasts and compare the previous two sentences with these examples. Past progressive, I was traveling in Italy when the earthquake hit in California. Present progressive, I'm traveling in Italy right now and will respond to your email when I return home. Both sentences describe actions that were in progress, not completed, in their respective time frames. One simple test to distinguish between simple past and present perfect is to add a specific time marker. So, I traveled in Italy during the summer of 2010. I have traveled in Italy, France, and England during the summer of 2010. Incorrect. Specific time marker very clearly shows that it's done, totally completed. If you use present perfect, then you don't want to add a specific time to tell the reader that this is totally done and not connected to the present moment at all. So again, if you're unclear about present perfect or simple past, these two sentences are a great example on page 313. In the second sentence, the time marker, during the summer of 2010, makes the sentence ungrammatical because it contradicts what the present perfect tense tells us, that the action of the sentence is still relevant, connected to the present time and not completely over. Now, not all simple past sentences include an explicit, clear, specific time marker, but one is implied by the use of the simple past. Adding a time marker, then, helps you test which tense is correct. If you can add the time marker without making the sentence ungrammatical, you should use the simple past. If you can't, you should use the present perfect. Really important rule, everybody. So look at that paragraph again. Pause it. Reread if you need. Now, getting close to the end of this tutorial, in the editing guide, using verb tenses correctly in your own writing. Now, we have covered a lot of ground in this tutorial. This is an idiom. It means we've talked about a lot of big ideas in one short tutorial. That's why I tried to say, take a break, go get some water, relax, rewind. This is a lot of information. Now, some of the points may be more relevant for you than others are. In general, you should keep the following points in mind when you're thinking about verb tense usage in writing. 1. When you're telling a story, which would include discussions of historical events, do not shift between past and present tense inappropriately. If the story happened in the past, use the past tense. The only time you should use the present tense is in framing comments about the story, what you think now, or what the situation means to you now. So, looking back on this, I realize, or to this day, my grandfather still talks about. 2. When describing something written by another author, research the verb tense connections for the discipline or genre you're writing in. Is the literary present expected, or is past tense required to describe the other writer's argument or actions? Once you know what is required for the task, double check your verb tenses when discussing a written resource. And here I'll say, if you're a science major, if you're an engineer, if you're going into nursing, if you're doing something, again, in the science fields, much more common to just use the simple past tense. Reporting facts, right? Reporting facts that clearly happened in the past. If you're a humanities person, like Jeff, if you like language, poetry, literature, communication, philosophy, history, might be more common to use the literary present. So again, don't be afraid to ask your teachers of other classes too, hey, what's the writing style for this class? Now we're on 314, number 3. If the English verb tenses are a problem for you, study the different verb tense and aspect combinations, how they're formed, and what their purposes are. This will give you a sense of the choices you have when you're writing. And number 4, be sure you understand the most common problems writers face with contrasts discussed in this tutorial. So these are the most common errors people make when they're choosing which verb tense, and that's why, again, this tutorial is really good. So big common problems in the simple present versus the simple past, the simple present versus the present progressive, and the simple past versus the present perfect. If these are tenses you tend to mix up, double check your verb phrases to make sure you've made the right choice. Now wrapping up on 315, an apply activity. Professor Ferris suggests that you, 1, select a paper you've written that includes a narrative or that describes at least one text written by another author. Look through the paper and determine whether you shifted tenses while telling the story, and if so, whether you were correct to make the shift. Are there any time markers later, afterward, for example, that help explain why you shifted tenses? If you use the correct verb tense when talking about another author's text, try to explain why you chose to use either past or present tense in that particular context. Write a short paragraph explaining what you discovered about your verb tense use, providing specific examples from your text to illustrate your analysis. And number 2, do you think increased awareness of your verb tense choices will help you handle them more accurately in your own writing? Or do you need to study them further? What resources or strategies might help you to do so? Write a paragraph responding to these questions. So, to wrap it up on page 316, what you've learned. So, you've learned that changing verb tenses within a narrative can be either correct or incorrect, depending on the context. You've learned that there are 12 different verb tense, time, and aspect state of completion combinations in English, and you've practiced forming these different verb tenses. You've learned that there are several verb tense contrasts, such as using past or present tense or past or present perfect, that can be problematic, difficult for writers. And you've learned strategies for editing your own writing for errors in verb tenses. So next steps, build on what you've learned if you want to keep going. You can review the basic characteristics of verbs in tutorials 1 and 2. You can learn about ways to avoid problems with subject-verb agreement in tutorial 20. And you can learn about verb phrase characteristics in tutorial 24. So you see lots of tutorials in this book are about verbs. Why? Because in English, verbs are basically the boss of the sentence. Don't get me wrong, subjects are very, very important, but verbs run the show. They are so, so, so important, and especially for English language learners, because when you get more advanced, like we are in this class, you got lots of different parts to put together. Do you need a modal? Do you need an auxiliary? Do you need a negative, negation? Do you need a ing? Do you need an ed, right? Again, if you go back and look at the example of the future perfect progressive, there's a lot going on there, right? So again, there's a lot going on with English verbs, and that's why there are so many tutorials in this book and lots of opportunities for you to think about these things, practice them, and come up with questions. So do that. Come up with questions, bring them to class, let me know what you're thinking or wondering, and we can talk about this together when I see you in the future. So thank you for watching this tutorial, and I'm excited to see you all soon. Thank you, everybody.